Hey, welcome everyone to this series on loops. I'm Kramer and this is an introduction to loops. So what are loops? In computing, loops are used when we want a task to repeat over and over and over again. It's really important in computing. You see them everywhere and we even see them a lot in our day-to-day lives. So imagine pouring a beer. You're pouring and pouring and pouring. You're pouring until your glass is full. And that's what a loop is. We have a task that we want to repeat, so pouring, and we stop once the condition is met, the glass being full. Another example is sawing a bit of wood. You keep sawing and sawing and sawing. You continually saw until it's cut into two. So why do we write loops? Loops allow us to write and repeat less code, which is always a good programming practice, makes stuff easier to change, less places for bugs and errors. So say I wanted to print my name 5 times. Without a loop, I need to say print Kramer, print Kramer, print Kramer, print Kramer, print Kramer. I need to write that statement out 5 times. Whereas with a loop, I only need to write that statement once and chuck it in the loop. And that loop will iterate over my statement 5 times, printing out my name 5 times. Another cool feature about loops is, say I want to update my program. And now instead of printing my last name, I want to print my first name. So what I do is I simply just update the statement in the loop from print Kramer to print Thomas. And now I will print out Thomas 5 times. Whereas if I want to change my code where I was not using a loop, I would have to go through each statement and update each line to print Thomas. And it's just a lot more error prone and it's just not as ideal as using a loop. So an iteration is one execution of a loop body. So we would say my name loop ran for 5 iterations. And just a quick overview of this loop. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the for loop. I'll do that in another video. I just want to explain the iterations here. So in this loop, we're starting at 0, I equals 0, and we're going to 5 exclusive. And that's just another way to say, while I is less than 5, keep repeating this code in the loop body. And after every iteration, I increment I by 1. So just stepping through it, I start I off at 0, and then I step into the first iteration. Output my name, and loop back up, and increment I by 1. And what I'm doing here, before I step into the next iteration, or before I step into every iteration, I'm just checking, is I still less than 5? And if I is still less than 5, enter the next iteration. So now in iteration 2, I print my name and come back to the top. So increment I by 1, enter the next iteration, print my name. Increment I by 1, enter the next iteration, print my name. Increment I by 1, next iteration, print my name. Increment I by 1, and now we see, okay, I is no longer less than 5 anymore. I is now 5. So we do not enter the next iteration. So we now jump to the end of the loop. And we can now say this loop ran for 5 iterations. So in programming, you're going to see 3 main types of loops. And the main difference between all these types of loops is that number of iterations. So with the for loop, we just saw it iterated for a set number of times. So that was, I wanted to print my name out for 5 times. It was set for that 5 times. Whereas the while loop, it iterates 0 more times, and the do while loop iterates 1 or more times. Okay, so choosing the most appropriate loop. You can interchange these loops with each other, just there are some situations where it's going to be more suitable to use one loop over another loop, and we'll just take a quick look at those. So when you use the for loop, you're going to use the for loop when you're iterating for a set number of times. So a suitable example is looping over an array. In programming, we can pretty much always be able to retrieve the length of the array somehow with a variable on the array or some kind of method. So looking at this loop, I'm looping from 0 to the length of the array. I know my number of iterations is set to that array length, and that's why it's an appropriate situation to use that for loop. Another good example is you want a task to execute X a number of times. So that's just what we were going over before, where I wanted to print my name over, say 5 times. Perfect example of the for loop because I have a set number of times, so the number of iterations is known. Okay, so when to use the while loop? We use the while loop when the number of iterations is unknown. We're running 0 or more times, and there's some kind of condition that can control when the loop ends. So a suitable example for the while loop would be a program for flying a drone. So if you've ever flown a drone before, especially with the newer ones, you'll know there's some safety features to not allow you to fly the drone on low battery. When it's on low battery, it wants to come back home. And why this is, well, you wouldn't want to be flying a drone and suddenly you reach 0% battery and your drone just falls out of the sky. Wouldn't be a good user experience, so there are a lot of safety features there's a lot of optional safety features in the drone. So this is kind of a program to try and replicate the safety features. So in this program, we have a threshold battery starting at 30. So that's the minimum battery we want to be flying on. We get the current battery level. So drone battery equals get current battery level. And we have a loop condition. So while the drone battery is greater than that threshold battery, we continue to fly the drone. And all I do here is output drone is flying safely. But you can imagine in a real world example, there'll be a lot more complex stuff going on here. And then at the end of the loop, I get the battery level again. And then I go back, check the condition again. If the drone battery is still greater than that threshold battery, then I continue to loop and loop until the drone battery is no longer greater than the threshold. That's when I would exit the while loop and continue down here, printing out a low battery warning message. So the while loop is suitable in this situation because we don't actually know how many times we're going to iterate, so we don't know how fast that battery level is going to drain on each iteration. So that's why, since we don't know how many iterations we're going for, the while loop suitable. We also do want to run 0 or more times, and why we want to run 0 or more times is, say you're just turning on your drone and the battery's at 1 or 0%. And what the while loop does, it's going to avoid us actually executing any code within the loop when we don't meet that condition of being over 30. Say when we just started up our drone, the battery is 1%. We then check the while condition. So we say, okay, is 1 greater than the threshold battery? No. Don't execute any of this code and immediately output low battery. And that's perfect for this example because we don't actually want to fly on 2%, 1%, 0% battery. Okay, so I'm just going to compare the while loop and the do while loop for this example. I'm just going to talk about why the do while loop would not be a suitable loop for this example. And the reason why is it comes down to the different number of iterations. So the while loop had, if we remember, 0 or more iterations, whereas the do while loop has 1 or more iterations. And just going to step through the code and kind of show why that's not suitable here. So starting at, let's just say the battery level starts at 10. We turn on the drone and the battery is 10. Stepping through the first line, they're the same for both loops. We're just setting that threshold battery to 30. Going to the next line, we're getting the current battery level of the while loop. So getting the current battery level and throwing that into the drone battery. Whereas in the do while loop, we've already entered that loop body, and that's because the conditional check statement that only happens at the end. So we jump into the loop body straight away. Going to the next statement. Okay, we got the battery level 10, 10, and 10 is stored into drone battery on each one. For the while loop, we're now checking that condition. So is the drone battery greater than the threshold battery? That's going to evaluate to false. Whereas in the do while loop, we're about to output drone is flying safely already. Going to the next line, the while loop evaluated the false, so we stepped out the while loop and went to the next line after the while loop, so printing out low battery. Whereas in the do while loop, we're getting the current battery level at the end. It's kind of redundant to get it twice, but it still kind of shows how this works. Going to the next part, now we actually, for the while loop, we printed low battery, returning the drone to home. That the while loop's completed now. We didn't have any iterations of the loop because the battery level was too low. For the do while loop, we just finished one iteration of the loop, and now we're checking that statement. And that's because the do while loop always runs at least one time. And you can kind of see for this example, it's bad because, well, we don't want the drone to fly one time when the battery, say the battery level was 0. You shouldn't be able to fly the drone on such a low battery. So now we check the statement. Now the statement is false, and so now we stop iterating over the loop. And now we output low battery, returning drone to home. Cool. So when do we actually want to use the do while loop? Number of iterations is unknown. We're running one or more times. So we want to ensure a task always runs at least once, and same as the while loop, there's a condition that controls when the loop ends. So a suitable do while loop example is a menu. So it makes sense when you have a program to always display, you always want to display the menu at least once to the user, but depending on what options they pick, you may want to iterate back over multiple times when they select a different option. When they finish, kind of like a pathway, redisplaying that menu for a different option to be selected. And so that's kind of what this do while loop does here. Do, output the menu, get the user's choice, and depending on the user's choice, you might want to view their user profile, the user might view their settings, or if they pick number 3, they might exit the application, and that's when the loop would end. If they input an invalid choice, we will loop around, redisplay that menu, get the next choice, and so on. So that would run one or more times. And we also don't know how many iterations the user will run through. That's all up to the user. So that's another example why the do while loop is suitable here. Cool, so thanks for watching. Check out my further videos that I'll create on more information about each loop. So I'll create a for loop video, a do while video, and a while loop video, just about more information on how they work exactly. But cool, thanks for watching. If it helps you, please give a like and a sub, and leave any feedback in the comments. Thank you.